The ship docked in the early morning fog, its hull groaning as it settled against the wooden port of New York. Inside one of the lower compartments, Helga Schmidt sat silently among dozens of other German women, her back rigid and her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She hadn't slept in over 30 hours, too afraid of what awaited them once they set foot on American soil. The air smelled of salt, oil, and something unfamiliar, freedom, perhaps, or the illusion of it. As the guards opened the hatch, a burst of sunlight streamed in, and instinctively she shielded her eyes. From the start of their journey across the Atlantic, Helga had prepared herself for humiliation and pain. Nazi propaganda had been relentless. America was portrayed as a chaotic land full of vengeance and cruelty. Women were warned that capture meant degradation, that American camps were filthy, violent places where no mercy was shown to German prisoners. She believed it because she had nothing else to believe. Stories passed between the women during the crossing only deepened their dread. The train ride from the harbor was quiet, almost eerily so. Soldiers escorted them, but not roughly. There were no shouts, no dogs, no threats. Still, the tension inside the train car was palpable. No one spoke above a whisper. Helga sat by the barred window, staring at the scenery that passed, a blur of trees, small towns, and children playing in open fields. It was nothing like what she had imagined. When the train slowed and finally screeched to a stop, she braced herself. Her throat went dry. This was it. She expected barking commands, perhaps armed guards yelling in a language she didn't understand. Instead, she saw a handful of American soldiers walking calmly toward the car, not with guns, but with buckets of water and a small basket of bread. One of them, a young man with sandy hair and a quiet demeanor, approached their car and offered a cup through the bars. His German was rough but understandable. "Water. You must be tired." Helga hesitated. Was it a trick? Was the cup poisoned? She glanced at the other women, but they were as frozen as she was. Then her thirst betrayed her fear. She reached out with trembling fingers and took the cup. The water was clean and cold, sharper than she expected, and somehow it made her throat ache even more as it went down. For a moment, she couldn't think. The simplicity of the gesture, water given freely, shattered something in her. Her image of the enemy, of this country she had been taught to hate, began to blur at the edges. What kind of captors offered water and bread? They were led out in small groups. No shouting, no blindfolds, just quiet efficiency. Helga couldn't stop looking at the faces around her. The Americans weren't gloating, nor did they look angry. Most looked bored, some even curious. It felt surreal, like walking into a painting where everything looked normal but felt impossibly strange. As she stepped onto the platform, she noticed the buildings. They were whole, painted, even charming. There were trees, real trees with leaves turning golden in the September breeze. A child's laughter rang out from somewhere nearby, and it struck her like a slap. That sound didn't exist in wartime Germany. It had been swallowed by air raids and sirens years ago. Later, as the women were herded toward trucks that would take them to the camp, Helga caught herself wondering if she was still in danger. Everything felt too calm, too organized, too kind. And that, somehow, was more terrifying than the alternative. If this wasn't the brutal America she had imagined, then what else had been a lie? Her heart pounded not with panic, but with confusion. As the truck rumbled to life and pulled away from the station, she clutched her coat tightly around her. Something had shifted. She had crossed a line that morning, one not marked by borders or barbed wire, but by the beginning of doubt. The trucks drove for nearly 2 hours through a patchwork of rural roads, winding past forests,
quiet towns, and farms with fields that stretched endlessly in all directions. Helga sat beside the other women, her legs numb and her thoughts racing. She expected to see signs of military activity, tanks, barbed wire, searchlights, but instead she saw little more than farmland and occasional schoolhouses. Everything looked so ordinary that it made her uneasy. The lack of visible hostility only deepened her suspicion.
When they finally arrived at the gates of Fort Meredith, Helga scanned the campgrounds with apprehension. The fences were tall, yes, and there were guards with rifles, but the camp itself resembled a small, orderly village. The buildings were simple but intact, lined up like classrooms or dormitories. There was no stench of rot, no dogs snarling, no screaming. Just the quiet thrum of routine and a cold autumn breeze brushing across her face. Each prisoner was processed with clinical efficiency. They were assigned bunks, given uniforms, and handed soap and towels. Helga was startled by the cleanliness of the facilities. The showers worked, the toilets flushed. The mattresses, while thin, were covered in clean linens. It all felt too deliberate, as if someone had staged a show for outsiders. Still, it was impossible to ignore the contrast with the devastation she had left behind in Germany. Captain Julia Harris, the American officer in charge of their orientation, stood at the front of the barracks and addressed the group in a mixture of English and carefully practiced German. Her tone was firm but not cruel. She outlined the rules of the camp. No escape attempts, no fighting, follow orders, maintain hygiene. But then came the unexpected. She assured them they would be fed 3 times a day, given medical attention if needed, and allowed to write letters to their families. The words felt unreal, like dialogue from a film Helga had never seen. She kept waiting for the moment when the illusion would crack, when the true face of the enemy would show itself. But Captain Harris spoke with measured calm, and the guards standing behind her looked more bored than hostile. There were no jeers, no spitting, no threats. Only instructions, delivered with a sense of reluctant duty. That night, lying in her narrow bunk, Helga stared at the wooden ceiling and tried to piece together her thoughts. She still felt like a prisoner, but something didn't align. The food they had received at dinner was simple but filling. No one shouted at them, no one struck them. The other women whispered their confusion in the dark, unsure whether to trust what they were seeing. Then the unexpected happened. A camp clerk came down the aisle calling Helga's name. He handed her an envelope with a Red Cross stamp. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was a letter from her sister Elsa, written in shaky German script. Elsa described another air raid in Cologne, the destruction of their childhood neighborhood, the death of several neighbors. Food was scarce. Hope was scarcer. The letter hit her like a blow to the chest. She sat motionless, reading it again and again, tears gathering in her eyes. It described a world so unlike the one she had just entered. There, her family lived under constant threat. Here, she had warm soup, soap, and a real bed. The guilt washed over her in waves, crashing against her already shaken certainty. That night, sleep didn't come. Instead, Helga lay still, listening to the faint sounds of the camp around her. Boots crunching gravel, distant radio static, the soft cough of a guard posted outside. This wasn't the America she had been taught to fear, but she didn't know yet if it was real or just another layer of war. All she knew was that her world was beginning to shift in ways she hadn't prepared for. A week after their arrival, a new notice was posted on the barracks wall, written in both English and German. It listed the names of prisoners who had been assigned camp duties. Helga scanned the list slowly, her name catching her attention next to the word hospital. Her heart sank at first.
She assumed this meant cleaning floors or emptying bedpans under the eyes of hostile guards. But when she reported to the infirmary the next morning, she found something far different. The camp hospital was modest but impressively organized. Rows of beds, clean white curtains, shelves neatly lined with medical supplies. The antiseptic smell of alcohol and iodine reminded her of the hospital back home in Cologne before the war had turned it into a triage center for bomb victims. A nurse greeted her, a tall American woman in her 30s with auburn hair and a tired, thoughtful expression. Her name was Sarah O'Connor, and her eyes lingered on Helga for a moment longer than necessary before she gestured for her to follow. Helga was given basic tasks: sorting supplies, sterilizing instruments, preparing linens. It was quiet work, mechanical in its repetition. Yet something about the space felt safe. For the first time since her capture, she moved through her day without being watched like a criminal. Sarah remained professional, offering instructions clearly, and though her tone was reserved, there was no condescension in her voice. The first real shift came on the third day. A small child was brought into the hospital, a 4-year-old girl with flushed cheeks and glassy eyes. She was the daughter of another prisoner and had developed a fever overnight. The mother, desperate and exhausted, clung to her child while Sarah tried to take her temperature. But the girl shrieked and pulled away, frightened by the nurse's foreign face and strange words. Helga, observing from a distance, felt a reflex rise from deep within her. Without thinking, she stepped forward and knelt beside the bed. She began humming a lullaby, an old German melody her mother used to sing on stormy nights. The little girl froze, then slowly turned her head toward Helga. The tension in the room seemed to dissolve as the child stopped crying and reached toward her. Sarah watched in silence. Helga gently wiped the girl's forehead and whispered reassuring words in German. She coaxed her to drink a bit of water and let Sarah check her pulse. Within minutes, the situation was under control. The fever remained, but the fear had passed. And something else had changed. Something in Sarah's face, in the way she looked at Helga. Later that evening, as they cleaned the examination room together, Sarah broke the silence. "You're good with children," she said in slow, careful English. Helga hesitated, then nodded. "I was a teacher," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before everything." That short exchange felt monumental, like 2 flags raised across a no-man's land. Over the next days, a fragile rapport began to take shape between them. They exchanged simple phrases in each other's languages, shared smiles at small victories, an infection that cleared, a patient discharged. Helga began to feel a sense of purpose again, even if fleeting. The hospital, with its rhythm and structure, offered a kind of sanctuary from the uncertainty that still clouded her thoughts. But not everyone looked kindly upon this connection. Ingrid Weber, another prisoner, eyed Helga with suspicion and whispered warnings at night in the barracks. She believed the Americans were using kindness as a weapon, softening them, breaking their pride. "Don't be fooled," she hissed. "They smile today so they can crush us tomorrow." Helga didn't respond. She couldn't yet argue, but the memories of the child's hand in hers, of Sarah's quiet trust, were harder to ignore than Ingrid's warnings. One afternoon, as Helga returned to her bunk after her hospital shift, she noticed something left on her pillow. It was a small bar of soap wrapped in paper with English writing. Underneath, a folded note with a single line in clumsy German: "Thank you for your care." It wasn't signed, but she knew it had come from someone in the medical staff. Her fingers traced the letters for a long time. That night, she lay awake with the bar of soap still on her chest like a relic. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or how long this strange peace would last. But for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel entirely like a prisoner. Somewhere inside her, a door had opened, and even though fear still lingered, something warmer had entered too. Outside the wire fences of Fort Meredith, life in the nearby town followed a rhythm untouched by the war's immediate chaos. Shops opened on time, church bells rang on Sundays, and families gathered around radios in the evenings. One of the regular suppliers to the camp was Violet Gray, a widow who ran a modest dairy farm just outside town. Her son Peter had enlisted 2 years earlier and never returned from the beaches of Normandy. Since then, Violet had avoided anything that reminded her of the war, especially the enemy. Every week she delivered milk to the camp kitchen, always dropping off the crates without speaking to anyone. She refused to look directly at the prisoners, convinced that seeing their faces would reopen wounds she had just barely learned to hide. To her, German meant murderer. There was no space for nuance, no distinction between a soldier and a nurse, between a general and a girl. All had taken her son from her. But everything changed one chilly October morning. Violet arrived earlier than usual, and, while waiting for a staff member to sign her delivery sheet, happened to glance through the window of the camp infirmary. What she saw stopped her cold. A young German woman in a plain uniform knelt beside an elderly female prisoner, carefully bandaging an open wound on her arm. Her movements were gentle, practiced. There was no arrogance or coldness, only care. For a moment, Violet felt herself transported back in time, to a memory of Peter as a boy, tending to an injured bird he had found in their barn. He had wrapped the creature in a sock and fed it with a dropper, whispering encouragements. That same tenderness, that same instinctive kindness, was now reflected in the hands of a woman Violet had been taught to hate. The realization unsettled her more than she could admit. She drove home in silence, the crates rattling softly in the back of her truck. That night, she pulled a small book from her kitchen drawer, a German-English dictionary Peter had bought before his deployment. He had written his name on the inside cover in pencil, along with the words, "To understand is to disarm." Violet stared at the inscription for a long time, her hands trembling. Days passed. She tried to forget the image, but it clung to her. The woman's face, her concentration, the softness of her touch, it all haunted Violet's thoughts. Finally, after a restless night, she made a decision. She would return to the camp, not just as a supplier, but as someone with something to give. Not forgiveness, she wasn't ready for that, but perhaps a gesture. When she arrived, the guards were surprised by her request. She asked to see the woman who worked in the infirmary, though she didn't know her name. The request was passed through channels, and within an hour, Helga found herself led to a small room near the administrative building. She entered nervously, unsure what to expect. Violet stood by the window, the dictionary in her hands. There was silence at first. Then Violet placed the book on the table and slid it toward Helga. "To help you write home," she said softly. Helga looked down, recognizing immediately what it was. She touched the faded cover, then met Violet's eyes. "Your son?" she asked in quiet English. Violet nodded once, unable to speak. What followed was a conversation built on broken phrases, hand gestures, and long pauses. Helga told Violet about her sister, about the bombings, about Cologne in ruins. Violet shared memories of Peter, his kindness, his humor, his dream of becoming a teacher. They spoke not as enemies, but as two women who had both lost pieces of their world. By the time Helga returned to her barracks, the dictionary pressed tightly to her chest. Something had shifted in her. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about connection, about rebuilding what war had tried to erase. The book was more than a gift. It was a fragile bridge between two lives that war had thrown to opposite sides of the battlefield. As winter crept toward the camp, the days grew shorter and the shadows longer. The chill seeped into the wooden barracks at night, even through layers of wool blankets. To lift spirits and bring a sense of normalcy, Captain Harris proposed a cultural exchange event between the town and the prisoners. The idea was simple: a small exhibition where the women could display crafts, traditional recipes, and music from Germany. For many of the prisoners, it was the first time in years they had been asked to share something rather than defend it. Helga threw herself into the preparations with unexpected enthusiasm. She began carving small wooden angels from leftover scraps collected from the maintenance shop. Each figure had its own shape, its own expression, some smiling, others solemn. She worked on them at night, sitting at the edge of her bunk, surrounded by the muffled breathing of sleeping women. The carvings reminded her of childhood winters, of her father whittling ornaments by the fire before the world changed. Word of the planned event spread quickly through the camp. The mood shifted from weary survival to cautious anticipation. Women sewed, painted, and even practiced singing old lullabies. For a moment, it felt as though war had been suspended, and something human, something peaceful, was allowed to bloom. Helga kept her growing collection of angels in a small cardboard box beneath her bed, adding to it with quiet devotion. But the reaction outside the camp was swift and harsh. When news of the event reached the local newspaper, outrage followed. Letters to the editor accused the army of coddling war criminals. Church leaders condemned the event from the pulpit. "Our boys are dying overseas," one column read, "and we're dancing with the enemy?" The town that had tolerated the camp's presence now turned openly hostile. Violet Gray bore the brunt of the backlash. Her participation, even as a volunteer, was seen as betrayal by her neighbors. The dairy lost customers. Friends stopped speaking to her at church. Someone left a note on her porch that read, "You've chosen them over your own son." The grief she had worked so hard to bury came rushing back, now tangled with shame and confusion. Inside the camp, the event was canceled without ceremony. A notice appeared on the mess hall door one morning, typed in English and German. Due to security concerns, the cultural exchange has been suspended indefinitely. No further explanation was given. For the prisoners, the cancellation felt like a rug pulled from beneath them. The warmth they had dared to feel was suddenly gone. Helga received the news in silence. That evening, she opened the box of wooden angels and looked at them under the dim light of her bunk lamp. The figures now seemed absurd, childish even. What good was hope when it could be revoked so easily? She wrapped them in cloth and slid the box to the back of the closet, unsure if she would ever take them out again. Some prisoners responded with anger, others with resignation. Ingrid Weber, always skeptical, declared the whole plan had been a trick. "You see," she said in a voice that carried through the barracks, "this is their mercy, just another way to mock us." Her words found new weight now, echoing through tired hearts that had opened and been cut once again. Helga stopped speaking English during her shifts at the hospital. She performed her duties with the same care, but the quiet warmth she had begun to share with Sarah O'Connor faded. Their conversations became rare, limited to the necessary. A coldness settled between them, one that neither of them knew how to thaw. Violet, too, withdrew. She stopped visiting the camp altogether, choosing instead to leave deliveries at the gate. She couldn't face the women she had begun to understand. The weight of her community's judgment was too heavy to carry. In the silence that followed, the fragile connections built between two worlds slowly unraveled under the pressure of fear, pride, and public opinion. For Helga, the wooden angels became symbols of something she couldn't name. Hope, perhaps, or foolishness.
She no longer knew whether she had been naive to believe that kindness could endure inside a prison. The winter deepened, and with it, a sense of emotional frost settled over the camp. No one knew it at the time, but the cancellation of the event marked the end of the brief, delicate season of trust. Snow blanketed the ground outside Fort Meredith in heavy silence. The landscape had turned white, but inside the camp, the air felt gray, quiet, tense, uncertain. Weeks had passed since the cancellation of the cultural exchange, and the optimism that once fluttered between prisoners and staff had all but vanished. Even routine felt heavier now, as if every action were performed under the weight of disappointment. Hope had become something fragile and unwelcome, like a song no one dared to hum. Helga moved through her days with mechanical precision. At the hospital, she cleaned instruments, checked inventory, and avoided unnecessary conversation. Sarah O'Connor respected the new boundaries, though Helga could sense the unspoken sadness in her eyes. The shared warmth between them had cooled, replaced by an invisible wall neither could cross. Their professional partnership remained intact, but the quiet humanity that had once filled the space between them had faded. One evening, after finishing her shift, Helga walked slowly through the snow-dusted courtyard. The December sky was already dark by late afternoon, but she didn't return to the barracks right away. Instead, she wandered past the empty recreation hall, past the mess tent, toward the edge of the camp near the wire fence. There she stood alone, breathing in the cold air, trying to make sense of the storm that still swirled inside her. The next morning, as Christmas approached, she made a quiet decision. She retrieved the box of wooden angels she had hidden weeks earlier and unwrapped each one with care. The figures were dusty but undamaged, their delicate wings and carved robes still intact. She selected one, the smallest, and wrapped it in a handkerchief, tying it gently with a red thread pulled from her uniform hem. It was her offering, one final gesture before the year's end. Carrying the wrapped angel, she approached the hospital office and asked to see Violet Gray. The guards hesitated, but, recognizing Violet's name and her previous visits, agreed to relay the request. An hour later, Violet arrived at the small visitors' room, her expression guarded but not cold. She looked older than before, wearier. The room smelled faintly of pine and disinfectant. Helga sat across from her, the angel resting in her palm. Without a word, she extended the bundle across the table. Violet hesitated before accepting it, unwrapping it slowly. When the angel emerged, its wings slightly uneven, its face carved with shy grace, she gasped softly. "For Peter," Helga said in quiet English, "so he is remembered." Violet's hands trembled, but she did not speak. Instead, she closed her fingers gently around the figure and nodded. The silence between them held more than words could express. In that small, undecorated room, two women, bound by grief, separated by war, shared something larger than politics or nationality. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a recognition of pain, a moment of truth that transcended the identities they had been assigned. They were not symbols. They were mothers, sisters, daughters, survivors. As Helga returned to her barracks that evening, snow began to fall again, slow, steady, almost silent. The barracks were dimly lit, most of the women already tucked under their blankets. She climbed into her bunk, the scent of pine and cold air still on her skin. Her hand instinctively reached for the small Red Cross envelope tucked beneath her mattress, a letter from her sister, confirming that their mother had survived another bombing. She closed her eyes and exhaled, not from relief, but from something deeper, a quiet release of the fear she had carried since the first day of captivity. She was still a prisoner. The war still raged across the ocean,
But something had changed within her. Kindness had survived, even behind barbed wire, even beneath layers of grief and propaganda.
Outside, the wind howled softly, brushing against the walls like a distant lullaby. In the darkness, Helga whispered to herself in German the words her father once said while carving wood by the fireplace. "Everything you make with care carries memory." The angel was gone now, but the memory it carried remained, and with it the faintest flicker of peace.